At 4 in the morning, before the sun came up, a coal miner's wife packed a tin pail with everything her husband would eat for the next 12 hours. A slab of bread, a piece of cold meat or pie, a flask of cold tea. Never water, because the water in the mines was poisoned with sulfur. That pail went 2,000 feet underground, sat on a rock ledge in a tunnel so narrow the miner couldn't stand up, and was eaten in total darkness by a man covered in black dust who couldn't wash his hands. This is the story of the meal that kept men alive in the most dangerous workplace in American history. And if you think you know what poverty looks like, what hard labor really means, what it takes to feed a family when every calorie counts, you're about to find out how little any of us actually understand about the price of the coal that built this country. Let's start at 4 in the morning, in a company house, in a town that the mining company owned. The miner's wife was already awake. She'd been awake for 20 minutes, moving quietly in the dark so she didn't wake the children sleeping 3 to a bed in the next room. There was no electricity in most mining towns until well into the 20th century, so she worked by the light of a single kerosene lamp, the same kind of lamp her husband would carry into the pit. The flame threw shadows across the kitchen walls, shadows that danced every time she moved. Her first job was the stove. She had to get the coal fire going, which meant she was burning the same substance her husband would spend 12 hours cutting out of the earth. The irony wasn't lost on these families. They lived on coal, they heated with coal, they cooked with coal, and coal was slowly killing the man who brought it home. The black dust was everywhere, on the windowsills, on the furniture, in the lungs of every person in that house, including the children who had never set foot in a mine, but the fire had to be hot enough to boil water for tea. Not coffee, tea. In the coal regions of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky, tea was the drink of the working class because it was cheaper than coffee and it traveled better. A flask of cold tea would stay drinkable for 12 hours underground. Coffee turned bitter and strange in the damp air of the mines. Tea just got stronger. Tea was survival in liquid form. The kettle took 15 minutes to boil on a coal stove. 15 minutes that the wife spent preparing everything else, working with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her hands moved automatically. Cut the bread, wrap the meat, check the pail for rust. Every motion practiced, every second accounted for. While the water heated, she cut the bread. Now, this wasn't the soft, pre-sliced bread you buy at a grocery store. This was a dense, heavy loaf she'd baked herself 2 or 3 days earlier. Because fresh bread was too soft to survive in a lunch pail, it would turn to paste in the humidity of the mine. The bread had to be stale enough to hold its shape, hard enough to resist crushing, but not so hard that a man with broken teeth couldn't chew it. And most miners had broken teeth. Dental care was non-existent in these communities. By the time a man was 30, he'd lost half his teeth to decay, to accidents, to the calcium deficiency that came from working in darkness for years without sunlight. So the bread was cut thick, 2 slices, sometimes 3, each one nearly an inch thick, and between them she put whatever protein she could afford that week. In a good week, that meant a slice of cold meat. Pork, usually. Beef was expensive, almost a luxury in mining communities. Chicken was rare because chickens needed grain and grain cost money. But pork was cheap in the coal regions because pigs could eat scraps, and every mining family kept pigs if they had any yard at all. The company houses usually came with a small patch of dirt behind them. Not a yard in any real sense, but enough space for a pig pen and maybe some vegetables. The meat was boiled or fried the night before and left to cool overnight, then sliced thin in the morning and layered on the bread. No refrigeration, of course. The meat had to be cooked enough to keep for 12 hours without spoiling, which meant it was cooked well past what any modern health code would allow. Gray, tough, salty meat that would survive the trip underground. It didn't taste good. It didn't need to taste good. It needed to provide calories and protein and keep a man on his feet. In a bad week, and there were many bad weeks, the protein was lard. Just lard. Smeared thick on bread. Fat and carbohydrates. That was lunch. That was what fueled 12 hours of swinging a pick in a tunnel so narrow you couldn't stand up. Lard and bread. The taste of poverty. Which is to say the taste of nothing. just grease and dough and the faint flavor of whatever the pig had eaten. Some weeks, there was no meat and not enough lard. Some weeks, the bread was thinner. Some weeks, the pail was half empty because there wasn't enough food in the house to fill it. The miners knew which families were struggling by the weight of the pails their men carried. A light pail was a sign of trouble. A heavy pail meant things were okay, at least for now. Sometimes there was pie, not dessert pie, the kind with fruit and sugar and flaky crust. Meat pie, a thick, dense crust filled with whatever scraps were available. Potatoes and onions, and maybe a little meat, if there was any left over from Sunday dinner. The filling was seasoned heavily to mask the taste of ingredients that were slightly past their prime. Welsh miners called them pasties, and they'd been eating them underground for 300 years before they ever came to America. The pasty was engineered for the mine. It had a thick, crimped edge, almost like a rope of dough running along one side that a man could hold with his filthy hands. He'd eat the filling and the thin crust, then throw away the thick part his fingers had touched. It was the original disposable handle, an edible tool designed for conditions that made washing your hands impossible. But not every family was Welsh. And here's something rarely discussed about the American coal industry. It was never one culture. It was a collision of 20 different cultures, all of them poor, all of them desperate, all of them bringing their food traditions 2,000 feet underground. We'll get to those traditions in a few minutes, but first, you need to understand what else went into that tin pail beside the food. The tea was poured into a flask, not a thermos. Thermoses with vacuum insulation didn't exist for working people until the 1920s, and even then they were expensive. Just a tin flask with a cork stopper, wrapped in a scrap of cloth to keep it from clanging against the sides of the pail and to provide a tiny bit of insulation. The tea was brewed strong, stronger than anything you drink today, with sugar if the family could afford it. Sugar was energy. Sugar was survival. A miner burning 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, more than double what the average person burns, needed every bit of sugar he could get. The human body running at that level of exertion craves simple carbohydrates. And the miners knew this instinctively, even if they didn't have the science. Sweet tea was better than plain tea. It gave you a boost when you needed it most. And the water situation underground was a nightmare that most people today cannot imagine. The mines were full of water. It seeped through every crack in the rock. It pooled in the low points of the tunnels, sometimes knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep. It dripped from the ceiling constantly, a steady cold rain that soaked the men as they worked. Miners wore oilcloth jackets when they could afford them. But even the best oilcloth couldn't keep you dry for 12 hours of constant dripping. But you couldn't drink that water. You couldn't drink it even if you were dying of thirst. The water in coal mines was contaminated with sulfur, with iron, with arsenic, with acids that would tear up your stomach and make you sick for days. Some mines had water so acidic it would eat through leather boots in a month. The water ran orange with iron. It smelled like rotten eggs from the sulfur. Men who drank mine water out of desperation, and some did, ended up with dysentery, with cramps, with intestinal damage that lasted the rest of their shortened lives. The tea wasn't a preference. It was the only safe liquid available for 12 hours of hard labor. When the flask was empty, you were done drinking until you reached the surface, so the pail was packed. Bread, meat, or pie, or just lard, tea, maybe a piece of fruit if the season was right and the family wasn't broke. Apples were common in the fall. They lasted, they traveled well. They provided a burst of sugar and moisture. But fruit was a luxury that many families couldn't afford regularly. The apple in a miner's pail was a sign of relative prosperity, of a family that was doing okay. And then there was the pail itself. You've probably seen pictures of these. Tin lunch pails, about the size of a small bucket, with a wire handle and a lid that clamped down tight. They look almost charming in photographs, like something from a simpler time. But what you might not know is that the design was specific to mining, evolved over decades to solve problems that are hard to imagine if you've never been underground. The pail had to be airtight enough to keep coal dust out of the food. This was crucial. Coal dust was everywhere in the mines, floating in the air, coating every surface, settling on anything left exposed for more than a few seconds. A pail with a loose lid meant food that was black before you could eat it, food that crunched with grit, food that tasted like the mine itself. The pail had to be watertight enough to survive getting soaked. Miners walked through standing water. They worked under dripping ceilings. A pail that leaked meant wet bread, ruined food, a long shift with nothing to eat. The seal had to work. The pail had to be small enough to fit in the cramped spaces where miners worked. In some coal seams, the tunnels were only 3 feet high. A miner working on his knees or his stomach couldn't have a big, bulky container banging around. The pail had to fit in a corner, on a ledge, clipped to a belt. Most pails had 2 compartments. The bottom held the food. The top, a shallow section just under the lid, held the tea flask. This kept the flask from crushing the food if the pail got dropped or kicked. Some pails had a small cup attached to the lid, so the miner didn't have to drink directly from the flask. The cup could be shared. A miner could offer a drink to a friend without passing around a flask that everyone's lips had touched. The design evolved over decades, getting more refined, more practical. By the 1890s, the lunch pail was a piece of engineering as carefully thought out as the mining equipment itself. Manufacturers competed to build better pails, more airtight, more durable, easier to carry. The pail was the miner's most personal piece of equipment, more personal even than his pick or his lamp. The wife closed the pail, latched it tight, set it by the door next to her husband's boots and his helmet and his lamp. Everything ready for another day underground, everything ready for another 12 hours of darkness and danger and labor that would leave him exhausted beyond description. And then she woke him up. If you're getting something out of this video, hit subscribe. We cover the stories of working people that history forgot every single week. And trust me, what comes next, what it was actually like to eat that meal 2,000 feet underground, is something you need to see. The miner walked to work in the dark. That's something people forget. The shift started at 6 or 7 in the morning, depending on the mine, which meant leaving the house at 5 or 5:30, which meant walking through a town where no one else was awake yet, carrying your lunch pail and your lamp, when heading toward a hole in the ground that might kill you before the day was over. The streets of a mining town in the early morning were empty except for other miners making the same walk. Their footsteps echoed off the company houses. Their breath steamed in the cold air, most of the year because the coal regions were in the mountains where winter started early and ended late. They didn't talk much. They were saving their energy. They knew what was coming. The mine entrance was called the drift mouth if it went straight into a hillside, or the shaft head if it went straight down. Either way, the transition from the outside world to the underground world was immediate and total. One moment you were breathing fresh air, seeing the last stars fading in the pre-dawn sky, feeling the temperature of the season on your skin. The next moment you were in darkness so complete that your eyes couldn't adjust because there was nothing to adjust to. The only light was your lamp and the lamps of the men around you, small flames that barely pushed back the black. The air was thick and wet and smelled like sulfur and coal dust and the sweat of 1,000 men who had come before you. The temperature underground was constant, about 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of the season. In winter, when it was 10 degrees outside, the mine felt warm. In summer, when it was 90 degrees at the surface, the mine felt cold. But it was always damp, always humid, with moisture levels approaching 100%. Your clothes were wet within an hour of going down, and they stayed wet until you came back up. And the space. This is what photographs can't capture. The tunnels in a coal mine were carved to be just big enough to remove the coal efficiently. The coal company wasn't going to pay miners to dig extra rock. They dug exactly enough space to get the coal out, no more. That meant ceilings as low as 3 feet in some seams. Miners worked on their knees, on their sides, lying flat on their backs, swinging picks at rock 6 inches above their faces. Imagine lying on your back on a hard surface. Now imagine swinging a heavy tool at something directly over your head over and over for 12 hours. Now imagine doing it in complete darkness, except for a single small flame. Now imagine breathing air so thick with dust that you can taste it. Feel it coating your throat, your lungs, your eyes. Now imagine doing this while wet, while cold, while knowing that at any moment the roof could collapse and crush you. That was the job. That was every day. In these conditions, there was no break room. There was no cafeteria with tables and chairs and hot coffee. There was no designated eating area. When lunchtime came, you ate where you were, which meant you sat on a rock in a tunnel barely tall enough to sit up in, surrounded by coal dust so thick you could taste it, and you opened your pail. Think about that for a second. Think about the cleanest environment you've ever eaten in. A restaurant with white tablecloths, your kitchen after you've just cleaned it, a picnic in a park on a sunny day. Now imagine the exact opposite. Now imagine something even dirtier than the opposite you just imagined. The air was full of particles. Every breath drew coal dust into your lungs, and every bite of food drew coal dust into your stomach. There was no way to avoid it. The bread your wife had packed that morning, the bread she had wrapped in cloth and sealed in that airtight pail, was covered in a fine black film within seconds of being exposed to the mine air. The meat was black, the tea in your cup was black. The miners ate it anyway. They had no choice. They needed 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day just to maintain their body weight, just to have the energy to swing a pick for 12 hours, just to walk back out of the mine alive at the end of the shift. The dust was part of the meal. It had always been part of the meal. It would always be part of the meal. Every miner knew he was eating coal dust. Every miner knew what that dust was doing to his lungs, and every miner ate anyway. Because the alternative was starving. And then there were the rats. Every coal mine in America had rats, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of them, tens of thousands. The rats lived on the food scraps that miners dropped, on the grain that fed the mules that hauled the coal, on the garbage that accumulated in the tunnels, on anything organic that made its way underground. And the rats were bold. They weren't the timid creatures you might see in a city alley. They were mine rats, generations adapted to the darkness, fearless around humans. They'd approach while you ate, watching with their wet black eyes, waiting for a crumb to fall. Sometimes they'd climb right into your pail if you set it down for a moment. A miner who left his food unattended would come back to find rats inside the pail, eating everything. The competition for food was fierce, even in the dark. Some miners befriended the rats. This sounds strange until you understand the loneliness of working underground. You couldn't see your co-workers most of the time. The tunnels branched off in different directions. You couldn't hear them over the noise of the picks striking rock and the rumble of the coal cars on their tracks. You were alone in a dark tunnel for hours at a stretch, with nothing but your lamp and your pail and your fear. And the rats were company. Miners would share their food with specific rats, ones they recognized by size or markings or behavior. They gave them names. They looked for them at lunchtime. They talked to them the way a lonely person talks to a pet. The rat didn't judge. The rat didn't care that you were covered in black dust, that you couldn't read, or that you'd never left the county you were born in. The rat just wanted food, and in exchange, the rat provided something that was in short supply 2,000 feet underground: companionship. But the rats were also a warning system. Miners learned to watch them. If the rats started running, something was wrong. Gas leak, collapse coming, fire in the timbers. The rats could sense dangers that humans couldn't, could feel vibrations in the rock that meant a roof fall, could smell gas building up in a side tunnel. Miners who paid attention to the rats sometimes lived when miners who didn't pay attention died. So there you are, 2,000 feet underground, sitting on a rock in a tunnel where you can't stand up, covered in black dust that you've been breathing for 6 hours, surrounded by rats, eating bread and cold meat in the light of a single flame that might go out at any moment. And you have to make this meal last, because you won't eat again for 6 or 7 hours, and you're burning energy faster than an athlete in competition. The miners developed rituals around eating. They had to. In a world with no structure, no supervision, no clock you could see, the lunch pail became the center of the day. Opening it was an event. Eating was slow and deliberate. Every bite counted, not just for nutrition, but for morale. The meal was a break from the labor. The meal was a moment of peace. The meal was the only thing separating the morning shift from the afternoon shift, the only marker of time passing. Some miners prayed before eating. They'd bow their heads in the darkness, their lips moving silently, asking for protection, for strength, for another day of life. Some miners shared food with younger miners who hadn't brought enough, teaching them the lessons of the pail, the lessons of survival. Some miners ate alone, savoring the silence, the brief pause in the relentless work. But all of them understood that this meal was the hinge of the day. The hours before it were endurance, the hours after it were survival. The pail was the pivot point. The tea was saved for last. Cold by now, whatever temperature it had started at, cold and strong and sweet if you were lucky. The miners drank it slowly, making it last, because once it was gone, there was nothing else safe to drink until you reached the surface. That last swallow of tea was the last good thing you'd have for 6 hours. You didn't rush it. And then the pail was closed. Empty now? Or nearly empty. Some miners saved a bit of bread for the walk home, a ritual of hope that they would live to walk home. And the pail went back on the rock ledge, or clipped to their belt, or hung on a nail driven into a timber, waiting for the end of the shift. That meal, that simple collection of bread and meat and tea, was the entire fuel supply for half a day of the hardest physical labor most modern people can imagine. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was what they had. If you've made it this far, you're clearly interested in how working people actually lived. Subscribe and stick with me, because now we're going to talk about something that makes this story even more complex. The fact that the miners eating those meals came from everywhere on Earth. The American coal industry was built by immigrants. Not just any immigrants, but specific waves of people from specific places, each group bringing their own food, their own traditions, their own ways of surviving underground. The first wave was British, Welsh, English, Scottish miners who'd been working coal for generations. They came to Pennsylvania in the 1840s and 1850s, recruited by mine owners who needed men who already knew how to dig. They brought the pasty. The Cornish pasty is probably the most famous mining food in history, a D-shaped pastry filled with meat, potatoes, and onions, with a thick crimped edge designed specifically for underground eating. The crimped edge was never meant to be eaten. It was a handle, a grip, a way to hold the food without touching the part you were going to put in your mouth. The miners held the pasty by the crimp, ate the filling and the thin crust, and threw away the thick edge their dirty hands had touched. Some pasties were huge, 18 inches long, divided into sections with meat on one end and fruit or jam on the other, so a miner could have a main course and dessert from a single piece of food. Welsh miners had their own version, smaller and denser, designed to fit in the narrow Welsh mine tunnels that were even tighter than American mines. They also brought bara brith, a fruit bread studded with currants and raisins that traveled well and provided quick energy from the sugar in the dried fruit. And they brought the tea tradition, steeping it strong enough to stand a spoon in, adding sugar until it was almost syrup. The Irish came next, fleeing the famine in the 1840s and 1850s, arriving in America with nothing but desperate need for work. They had no mining tradition. Most of them had been farmers, potato farmers specifically, which meant they knew about dirt and labor but knew nothing about working underground. Irish mining families adapted. The lunch pail got filled with soda bread, dense and filling, quick to make with just flour, buttermilk, and baking soda. No yeast, no rising time. Irish miners ate bread and lard more often than bread and meat, because they were at the bottom of the economic ladder. The English and Welsh looked down on them. The mine bosses paid them less. But they survived. They adapted. And their food went underground with them. Then came the Poles, the Slovaks, the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians. Eastern European immigrants flooded into the coal regions in the 1880s and 1890s, driven out of their homelands by poverty and political persecution. They were drawn by the promise of work, any work, even work that killed you. These miners brought kielbasa, the smoked sausage that could last for weeks without refrigeration. They brought pierogi, dumplings stuffed with potato and cheese that their wives made by the hundreds on weekends. They brought rye bread, darker and denser than the wheat bread of the British and Irish, bread that could fuel a man through a 12-hour shift. The Italian miners came in the early 20th century. They brought cheese, hard cheeses like pecorino and provolone that could survive in a lunch pail for 12 hours, cured meats like salami and prosciutto that didn't need refrigeration, bread soaked in olive oil, a concentrated source of calories that was foreign to the Northern European miners, but perfect for the work. What emerged in the mining towns was something unprecedented in American history, a food culture born underground. In the patches in the company towns, families from different countries lived side by side, often in the same boarding houses. The Polish family on one floor, the Italian family on another, the Irish family in the back, and they shared food. The Welsh miner's wife learned to make kielbasa from her Polish neighbor. The Italian miner discovered that tea was better than wine for underground work. The Irish family started adding meat to their soda bread after seeing the pasties the Cornish miners brought. This wasn't fusion cuisine in any modern sense. This was survival adaptation, taking the best food ideas from every culture and applying them to the specific problem of keeping men alive in the mines. By the turn of the century, a miner's lunch pail might contain elements from 5 or 6 different national traditions, all of it packed by a wife who had absorbed cooking knowledge from a dozen different neighbors. The melting pot wasn't just a metaphor in these communities. It was literally what happened in the kitchen, and the food mattered. It mattered for nutrition, obviously, but it also mattered for identity. A Polish miner eating his wife's pierogi 2,000 feet underground was maintaining a connection to a home country he might never see again. An Italian miner unwrapping cheese his mother had taught his wife to make was carrying his entire ancestry into that dark tunnel. The lunch pail was a container for food, but it was also a container for culture, for memory, for the stubborn insistence that even in this brutal place, even doing this brutal work, these men were still who they'd always been: Welshmen, Irishmen, Poles, Italians, people with histories and traditions that mattered, that couldn't be erased just because they'd come to America, just because they were covered in coal dust. The mining companies noticed this. They kept records of which ethnic groups worked, which jobs, which seams, which shifts. They played ethnic groups against each other deliberately, using food as one of the markers of difference. The Welsh ate this. The Poles ate that. They're not like you. They're competition. They'll take your job. But in the mines, in the actual tunnels, 2,000 feet underground, where no one could see what was happening, something different happened. Men who didn't speak the same language, who came from countries that had been at war with each other for centuries. So who looked at each other with suspicion and sometimes hatred above ground, they shared food underground. A Polish miner gave half his kielbasa to an Irish miner whose wife was sick and couldn't pack his pail. An Italian miner shared his cheese with a Welsh miner who'd lost his lunch to rats. The darkness of the mine was a kind of democracy. Everyone was black with dust. Everyone was scared. Everyone was hungry. The food became a bridge, not always, not perfectly. The ethnic tensions in mining towns were real and sometimes violent. But at lunchtime, in the dark, something else was possible. Hit subscribe if you want to keep learning about the people who actually built this country. Because now we need to talk about what happened to all those lunch pails after the miners were done with them. The lunch pail survived the shift. It came back up from the mine covered in dust, dented from being dropped or kicked or crushed against tunnel walls. The miner carried it home in the late afternoon or evening, handed it to his wife, and the cycle started again. Over time, those pails became artifacts, not because anyone planned it that way, but because these were families that didn't throw anything away. A good tin pail could last for years, decades even. It got passed down when a miner died or retired. It got inherited by sons who went into the mines themselves. It became a family heirloom without anyone using that word. Today, coal miner lunch pails are collectors' items. Museums display them. Antique dealers sell them for hundreds of dollars. People with no connection to mining hang them on walls as decoration. But for the families who actually use them, those pails meant something different. I talked to a woman in Scranton, Pennsylvania, whose grandfather was a miner. She still has his lunch pail. It sits on a shelf in her kitchen, dented and scratched, the tin showing through the paint in places where his hands gripped it every day for 30 years. She doesn't use it for anything. She doesn't display it prominently, but she won't get rid of it either. It's the only thing she has that he actually touched, actually carried, actually depended on for survival. That pail is a document. It records the shape of her grandfather's grip in the worn places on the handle. It records the mines he worked in, the scratches and dents. It records the food his wife packed, traces of which are probably still embedded in the metal at a microscopic level. It's not nostalgia. It's evidence. Proof that this man existed, that he did this work, that he came home. The lunch pail also became a political symbol, and this is something most people don't think about. When politicians talk about the working class, when they use phrases like lunch pail workers or lunch bucket Democrats, they're invoking these men. These specific men. The coal miners and steel workers and factory hands who carried their meals to work in tin pails because they were too poor to buy lunch and too proud to complain about it. The lunch pail became shorthand for a whole set of values: hard work, self-reliance, sacrifice, the willingness to do dangerous, dirty, underpaid labor because it was the only labor available and your family needed to eat. When a politician holds up a lunch pail, when they mention it in a speech, they're trying to connect themselves to that tradition. But here's what gets left out of that political symbol. The lunch pail was also a marker of exploitation. These men carried their own food to work because the mining companies didn't feed them. They ate underground in the dark because there were no break rooms, no cafeterias, no consideration for their basic comfort. The pail was practical because it had to be practical. It was small because the tunnels were small. It was airtight because the air was poison. Every feature of that lunch pail was a response to working conditions that were deliberately, systematically inhumane. So when a politician invokes the lunch pail worker, they're invoking a complicated legacy. Yes, these men worked hard. Yes, they provided for their families. Yes, they built the industrial infrastructure of the United States, but they did it under conditions that we would not tolerate for animals today. They did it while being poisoned, while being crushed, while being paid so little that lard on bread was a standard meal. The lunch pail is a symbol of dignity, but it's also a symbol of degradation, and you can't have one without the other. The mining communities knew this. They weren't naive about their own exploitation. That's why they organized. That's why they formed unions. That's why they went on strike again and again, risking everything they had, demanding better pay, safer conditions, the simple right to not be killed at work. The lunch pail went with them to the picket lines. It went with them to the union meetings. It was there when they won, and when they lost, and when they died trying. In 1914, in Ludlow, Colorado, mining families living in a tent colony were attacked by National Guard troops and company guards. The miners had been on strike for months, demanding recognition of their union, demanding decent wages, demanding the right to live in their own houses instead of company shacks. The company brought in soldiers. The soldiers brought machine guns. 21 people were killed that day, including 11 children who suffocated in a pit they dug under their tent to hide from the gunfire. The Ludlow Massacre became one of the most infamous incidents in American labor history, a moment when the country had to look at what was actually happening to the people who mined its coal. After Ludlow, in the photographs of the destroyed camp, you can see lunch pails scattered among the debris. On ordinary objects in an extraordinary scene of violence. The pail survived when the people didn't. That's what the lunch pail carries. Not just food, history, struggle, death. The whole complicated story of what it meant to be a worker in an age when workers were disposable. If this story matters to you, hit subscribe. We're almost at the end now, and I want to leave you with something you'll remember. At 4 a.m, before the sun came up, a coal miner's wife packed a tin pail with everything her husband would eat for the next 12 hours. She'd done it yesterday. She'd do it tomorrow. She'd been doing it for years, and she'd do it for years more until her husband's lungs gave out from the dust, or the roof came down on him in a section they hadn't timbered right, or he just got too old and broken to swing a pick anymore. The bread she cut was baked in an oven heated by coal. The meat she sliced came from a pig fed on scraps in a yard owned by the mining company. The tea she brewed was sweetened with sugar bought on credit at the company store, credit that would be deducted from her husband's pay, which was already smaller than it should be because of the fees and fines and deductions that the company imposed. Everything in that pail came from the mining economy. The family ate coal, breathed coal, lived coal. Their entire existence was organized around a black rock buried in the earth, a rock that they couldn't eat but couldn't live without. She closed the pail, latched it tight, set it by the door, and then she woke her husband, who would carry that pail 2,000 feet underground and eat its contents in total darkness, surrounded by rats and dust and the constant threat of death, and bring it back empty 12 hours later, ready to be filled again. That was the cycle. Pack the pail, eat the pail, empty the pail, repeat. For 30 years, if you were lucky. For 20 years if you weren't. For 10 years if the mine took you early, if the roof fell, or the gas exploded, or the black lung came on. Faster than usual. And the mines always took some of them early. The last generation of deep mine coal miners is dying now. The men who started in the 1950s and 1960s, the final wave before automation and strip mining and the slow collapse of underground coal changed everything. They're in their 80s and 90s if they're still alive at all. Their lunch pails are in museums or in attics or in landfills. Their stories are being told less and less because fewer and fewer people remember. But the food was real. The darkness was real. The dust that turned their lungs to stone was real. The love that packed those pails every morning, the love that made sure there was enough bread, enough meat, enough tea to keep a man alive for another day, that was real too. When you turn on a light, when you charge your phone, when you use any of the electrical infrastructure that this country runs on, you're connected to those pails. You're using the energy those men cut out of the earth while eating cold bread in the dark. The least we can do is remember what they ate. The least we can do is remember how they ate it. The least we can do is acknowledge that the comfort we live in was purchased, at least in part by men who couldn't afford meat every day, who ate lard on bread and called it lunch, who carried tin pails into the earth and hoped to carry them back out. At 4 in the morning, she packed the pail. At 4 in the afternoon, he brought it back empty. Every day, for 30 years. And now you know what was in it.